Hey everybody, and Tony here with a review of The Shining, which was shown during my flight from Toronto to Vancouver on Air Canada. The film was directed, written, and produced by Stanley Kubrick. It was co-written by Diane Johnson. It was based on the book by the same name by Stephen King, and it starred Jack Nicholson, Danny Lloyd, Shelley Duvall, and Scatman Crothers. Now, I didn't really see The Shining ever since I was a little kid. But growing up, I did see the references in which this movie was made in a lot of the cartoons and movies that I've watched ever since, well, I was a little kid. And the first one that came into my mind was the Samurai Jack episode Aku's Fairy Tales, in which Aku tells the story of the three little pigs, and Jack is being portrayed as the big bad wolf. There's the usual dialogue between both the wolf and the pigs. And then Jack proceeds to say, then I'll huff and I'll puff and then I'm coming right in. And then he hacks down the door with his katana. And then he says the very famous line, "Here's Jackie." And I thought that was just very hilarious. And then the next one that comes into my mind was the Simpsons Treehouse of Horror episode, The Shining, in which the Simpsons, well, they drive up to a very abandoned hotel hosted by the boss of Homer Simpson, C. Montgomery Burns, and his assistant Smithers, and then there's the usual stuff that happens. The blood coming out of the elevator to the hallway, the maze, and then comes the very famous scene in which Homer starts to go crazy, all because there's no beer and no television, all because of the fact that Burns basically cut off the electricity and took away all the beer supply. So yeah, basically just to mess with the Simpson family. And then Homer starts to go on a murderous rampage. But it's all done for laughs in this episode, since this is basically a homage to The Shining, which it was, and it was a lot of fun. And then the third one that comes into my mind was the scene from the Rocko's Modern Life episode Uniform Behavior, in which Heifer enters Conglommo and sees two twin beavers, I guess. And then they said, "Come join us, Heifer," and then they just disappear. And then Heifer enters a bar in which the color palette is just all red. He meets Lloyd, and Heifer begins to say that he would sell his soul for a soda. Then he gets it, and my goodness, what happens right there is such a huge homage to The Shining. And then comes the also famous line with Lloyd saying, "Here's Heifer," with Heifer's head on the door. And I thought that was just done so hilariously. It's so brilliantly. And I could name a lot of other cartoons, movies, TV shows that reference The Shining, but we'd be here all day. And I could really see why this film has become quite the classic. But does it really hold up for me these days? Or does it kind of falter or make it seem dated? So, let's get on with the review. Now, story-wise, this is extremely fascinating, and this is how a lot of horror movies should take cues from these days. Instead of relying on jump scares or like those cheap type of scares that usually leave them extremely jumpy, instead of just like truly scared and truly fascinated, this really knows how to use atmosphere to its advantage. From the cinematography to the music, these factors really help the story of the film really shine. And this is basically also a survivor story of one wife who has to protect her own child, especially since her own husband has gone crazy throughout all of these circumstances that he got himself into, especially since that he's also one of the workers of this hotel and has to show his family around it. But he gets himself a deal that he has to kill his own family in order to get himself a bigger price in life, which is actually really scary when you think about it. And I could honestly see why reviewers like Jaime Tude alongside his co-reviewer LT placed it as number one on their top 10 best horror movies of all time. And by the way, James, LT, if you're watching this video right now, I really love your top 10 horror films of all time. It's actually one of my most favorite videos that I've watched from your channel of all time, and I had a lot of fun with it. So going back to the story, this is definitely very fascinating, and it was just a lot of fun, and it really helps in terms of the atmosphere, and it didn't really need to rely on a high body count to really make this film any scarier than it is. It just needs atmosphere, it just needs tension, and it just needs to give you a sense that something is not always going to be right. And a little amount of disturbing scenes, though it's not too obnoxious with it. It manages to really weave itself very well. It's well timed, it's well paced, and it will leave you with a lot of shivers from the beginning of the film to the end of it. It will leave you shivering. And then comes the cinematography. What more can I say about Stanley Kubrick? He is a master when it comes to using the visuals in his advantage. And not to mention, the cinematography for this film was done by John Alcott. So basically, Stanley really knew what to do in terms of the cinematography. He really knew which angles these shots would be taken, especially the very interesting close-up shots or even the wide shots. Everything about it was just well shot, well lit, and everything was just so well done, especially the effect of the blood coming down from the elevator, and everything about it was just awesome from beginning to end in terms of its cinematography. And then we have the music. Now, while the music sounds pretty dated by today's standards with the use of synthesizers and a lot of other 80s instruments, it manages to hold itself up very well in terms of the creep factor. I mean, you have moments in which there are basically chattering noises, screeching noises, and a lot of unsettling noises that really heighten the tension of this film. They basically help enhance the spookiness and the eeriness of this film. And it really does a fantastic job. Even though the music is pretty dated by today's standards, it actually holds up very well if you take the datedness away. It holds up very, very well. Not to mention, they also use a good amount of instrumental pieces that usually reminds me that of a Verdi opera, a Puccini opera, or even that of an opera by the likes of Alban Berg and many other composers of the 1920s, 1930s, and 1940s and 1950s. They basically remind me of those compositions of certain operas at the times, whether it comes from Verdi, Puccini, Mascagni, or even the likes of Alban Berg, Ottoman Schock, or many other men, or even Francis Poulenc. They basically use a great deal of music. Since this is composed and arranged by Wendy Carlos and Rachel Elkind, this is definitely fantastic work when it comes to the music, as it really heightens the atmosphere. Then we have the characters, all of them being very memorable and very iconic. Jack is, simply put, a man who has dealt with the stress of being a father, like being a lot of other things in life, and especially being a host to this hotel, showing other people around, and especially the stress of his job, and especially that of his current condition. I mean, he's definitely a character you can also write a book on, and he's not just seen as the anti-hero or the main villain of this movie. He's a lot more than that. And he's definitely quite fascinating as an anti-hero, and has become one of the most iconic anti-heroes, villains, you name it, that cinema has ever seen. Then we have Wendy. Now, at first glance, Wendy might seem like your very homely and very, very sweet, very docile type of wife. But once she gets herself into a position in which she has to defend herself, then she really does her best to try to defend her son from the insane bouts of her own husband. Now, Danny is also a very interesting character as well. Well, at first glance, you might think, oh, he's simply put an inquisitive child who is very curious about everything. He does have a little special something. He has an imaginary friend inside of him by the name of Tony. And every time he has Tony speak, he lifts up his finger, and then Tony starts talking in a very raspy voice, and it moves. And I thought to myself, wow, it looks genuinely creepy, but how did he get his power? How did he get Tony inside of him? We'll never know, but still, despite this little interesting little mystery, it's actually awesome to see that Danny is one of those child characters that I can actually really enjoy watching, not to mention Mr. Halloran. While at first glance he might seem a little bit like a side character, he's actually very knowledgeable and actually a very interesting character. So the four main characters, which are the bread and butter of the story, are definitely worth watching and very interesting, and not to mention the O'Grady twins. Oh yes. Well, even though their appearance is mainly for nightmare fuel, I guess it's safe to say that we could really see what really surrounds this hotel mystery. And the characters are basically helped by the astounding performances by Jack Nicholson, Shelley Duvall, Danny Lloyd, and Scatman Crothers. Now, I first knew Jack Nicholson in the likes of films like About Schmidt and many other films from the 1990s and 1980s. Now, I could really see why critics and fans love him as Jack Torrance and why this is his most iconic role of all time. He really knows how to get Jack's bipolar nature down very well to a T. He also makes Jack a very interesting and very fascinating type of character, which really helps with the mannerisms, the understanding of this character, of what he goes through in this moment and situation. It is just extremely riveting, and I could really see why critics love his performance as Jack Torrance. Then we have Shelley Duvall. I first knew this actress as Olive Oyl in the live-action Popeye movie, and also one of the aunts from Casper Meets Wendy. And I also kind of knew her in those fairy tale segments that she did in the 70s. This was also an iconic role from her, and there was a lot of stuff saying that Shelley was also being tortured, so to say, by Stanley Kubrick because she didn't look scared or didn't look that frightened enough, and was basically going through a lot of psychological, physical, and mental trauma during shooting. And it really shows in her character, especially that famous breaking down the door scene. You could really see the terror that she has in her eyes, the sheer, ferocity that she brings into this character. Yes, it was working under pressure, but this worked fabulously. It worked really well, and even though it might not have worked well in her favor, I could really see why this has become one of her most famous roles, and it was such a great pleasure watching her. And then we have Danny Lloyd as Danny. Now, after his career as a child actor, he ended up becoming a teacher for many, many years. And Danny Lloyd manages to bring a very inquisitive and very interesting nature to that of Danny, and not to mention how he managed to deepen his voice for Tony was well done. And then we have Scatman Crothers. Now, I first knew Scatman Crothers as the voice of Hong Kong Phooey from, the Hanna-Barbera cartoon Hong Kong Phooey. He was a lot of fun in that role, and he really was a very enjoyable character, and he was just a lot of fun. Seeing him as Mr. Halloran was also a treat as well. He basically managed to make Mr. Halloran a very sympathetic and very enjoyable and very wise character. So overall, the acting is superb. And even though the actors had very small roles, this is also helped by the fact that they had main actors who gave it their all. So overall, The Shining truly is a testament of how great the horror genre can be. It had superb acting, which is considered nowadays as iconic. Scenes that are just extremely so iconic. Everything about this horror film is extremely iconic, and I can see that a lot of horror directors and horror writers are taking inspiration because of this film. So with that said, I give this film a well-deserved 5 out of 5 stars. It is a masterpiece. It is one of the masterpieces of the horror genre, and if you haven't seen this film yet, please, I order you to check this film out. You will not be disappointed, and you will definitely enjoy the fantastic performances that Nicholson, Duvall, Lloyd, and Crothers have to give. Everyone was just awesome in this film, and like I said, if you haven't seen this film yet, please do yourself a favor and check it out. You will not be disappointed. Well, that's all for now. Be sure to tune in later with my review of Coraline. So until then,